So this is chapter 11, The Joy of Reading, and the book we're reading is Heidi by Joanna Spyri, The Great Illustrated Classics. And I'm Maryann. As soon as Heidi learned how to read, she found that life in Mr. Sesame's big house was not so lonely. Now she had friends to keep her company when she was alone in this strange city. Downstairs in the study, there was a big library filled with many books. Some were too long or too difficult for Heidi to read, but there were many she could enjoy. Every afternoon, Grandma would take Heidi aside and ask her if she had finished her last book. If she had, Grandma would take Heidi's hand, and the two of them would go downstairs to the library and choose a new book. In the evenings, Heidi would take turns reading with Clara and Grandma. Sometimes they would read a whole book out loud. It made Clara very proud that her friend finally had learned to read, and now they could share the many wonderful things that books had to offer. But no matter how many books Heidi read, the one Grandma gave her was always her favorite. She read it over and over and kept it in a special place in her room. When she returned to the mountain, she would read it to Granny. Mr. Usher now had an easy time with Clara's lessons. Since Heidi had learned to read, the time went much faster, and Clara and Heidi were both eager to learn and were full of questions. Sometimes Mr. Usher would ask Heidi to read a long and difficult passage aloud. He was always pleased when she was able to do it easily. Although the books helped ease Heidi's loneliness, they could not stop her from thinking about Grandfather and her home in the mountains. Every time she looked at her picture book and saw the green meadow and the sheep, her heart longed to return where she belonged. Next, chapter 12, The House is Haunted. Not long after Heidi learned how to read, Grandma announced that she would be leaving. The day of her departure was a sad time for Heidi and Clara. They knew things would not be the same without Grandma. Soon after the old woman left, Heidi began to get very homesick. Every night she cried herself to sleep thinking about her home on the mountain. Sometimes she woke up shaking at the thought that Uncle Alp or Granny might be sick or that they would die before she returned. Things got so bad that she grew pale and thin. Even Sebastian looked worried when he saw her pushing her food away. At about this time, strange things began to happen inside the house. Every morning, Sebastian found the front door unlocked and standing wide open. Nothing inside the house was ever missing, so he was sure it wasn't a thief. Some of the servants began to worry. One evening, when Sebastian was up late, he saw a white figure on the stairs. Soon, even Miss Rotmeyer was frightened. She wrote Mrs. Seisman and asked him to come home at once. But Mr. Seisman did not take her strange story at all seriously, so Miss Rotmeyer told Clara about the open door and the white figure. Clara became so upset that Miss Rotmeyer wrote to Mr. Seisman saying that she feared for Clara's health. This time he believed her and came home at once. Sure enough, after Mr. Seisman arrived, he noticed that the front door was unbolted and standing open every morning. He became concerned about this strange occurrence and decided to get to the bottom of things. The next evening, Mr. Seisman invited his friend Clara's doctor to sit up with him and wait for the ghost. The doctor arrived promptly at 8, and the two men sat up talking and drinking strong coffee. Sometime after 12, they heard the distinct sound of a bolt being unlatched. Mr. Seisman exchanged looks with the doctor, and they walked slowly toward the front door. "Who's there?" asked Mr. Seisman. The figure turned and gave a little cry. It was Heidi. Barefooted and wearing her white nightgown, she began to tremble when she saw the two men. "Why, Heidi, what are you doing here?" asked the doctor. "I don't know," stammered Heidi. The doctor took Heidi by the hand and led her away from the door. He talked in a kind voice for a while. He soon discovered that Heidi had been sleepwalking. She was the ghost that everyone feared so much. After he finished asking her several questions, the doctor realized that Heidi was very homesick. so homesick that her health was beginning to suffer. The sleepwalking was a real symptom of her unhappiness and her longing to escape and return to her grandfather. The doctor spoke with Mr. Seisman. He explained that Heidi must be allowed to return to the mountain. "Just look at the child," he said. "She is pale and has lost several pounds in a short time. Without knowing it, she has been opening the front door every night. She should be sent home tomorrow. That's my prescription." Mr. Seisman looked very upset. He knew how much Heidi meant to Clara, but he also knew what the doctor was saying was true. He simply could not be responsible for Heidi becoming ill. He thought for a short time and then turned to his friend and said, "I know how upset this will make Clara, but I can see how things are. Heidi will leave for her home in the morning." Now we're on chapter 13, Home Again. Mr. Seisman was true to his word, and the very next morning he made arrangements for Heidi's departure. He had Miss Rossmeyer pack her trunk, and he went upstairs to tell Clara the news. Clara was very distressed by the news, and she tried to make her father change his mind, but soon she saw that he really was right. He promised Clara that he would take her to visit Heidi the following year. This made Clara feel a little better. Then she asked if she could put some nice things in Heidi's trunk. Mr. Seisman agreed and left Clara to be alone with her plans for gifts for Heidi and her friends at home. When Heidi found out about the journey, she became so excited she could hardly eat a thing. She was not sure whether she was really awake or just dreaming. But when Sebastian brought down her trunk, she knew everything was real. Clara packed some warm blankets, dresses, hankies, and sewing things for Heidi. Then she showed her the special surprise. It was a big basket of soft white rolls for Granny. Heidi kissed Clara warmly and held her hand, and the two friends said their goodbyes. Since the trip back to Dorfli was a long one, Sebastian offered to go with Heidi. They took a train from the city and didn't arrive in Dorfli until the next day. Heidi held the basket with the rolls on her lap the whole time. She worried that Granny might be sick or even dead, but as the train chugged to a stop, she became excited and happy. When they reached the station, Sebastian asked an old man driving a carriage which was the best way to get to Dorfli. The old man said he would take them there. Sebastian wasn't completely sure that the roads were safe in this country town, but Heidi knew that the roads were passable this time of year and offered to continue the journey on her own. Sebastian loaded her trunk onto the carriage and handed her a fat packet and a letter for grandfather. "The packet is for you. It's a present from Mr. Seisman. The letter is for your grandfather. It will explain everything," said Sebastian as he bent down to kiss Heidi goodbye. The man with the carriage was the baker from Dorfli. He had known Heidi's parents and realized at once who she was. They chattered a little bit as the horses pulled up the hill to the village. When they reached Dorfli, the baker lifted Heidi down. She thanked him and told him that grandfather would pick up the trunk later. As soon as the carriage pulled away, Heidi rushed uphill as fast as she could go. She had to stop every now and then to catch her breath, for her basket was heavy and the mountain was very steep. But all she could think about was Granny. When she reached the hut, she raced up to the door but could hardly open it because she was trembling so much. But she managed and threw it into the room, quite out of breath and unable to say a word. "Goodness me," someone from a corner of a room said. "That was how Heidi used to come in. How I miss her. It's me, Heidi," she cried, and threw herself on the old woman's lap and hugged her. Granny was so surprised she could not speak either. She stroked Heidi's hair, and a few big tears from her old blind eyes fell onto Heidi's hand. "It's really you, child," she said. "Yes, really and truly, Granny. Don't cry, I'm here. I'll never go away again," said Heidi as she held back her own tears. Then Heidi handed Granny the basket and brought out the rolls. One by one she laid them on Granny's lap. "Now you won't have to eat hard bread for a while," she said. Granny smiled. She could hardly believe all this was really happening. Just then, Peter's mother came into the hut. She rushed to Heidi and gave her a big kiss. She rushed to Heidi. Heidi talked with the two women for a while, then said goodbye and began the long climb up the mountain to Grandfather. The air was cool as Heidi made her way up the steep hill. Everything seemed even more beautiful than she remembered. The peaks of the mountains were snow-covered, the pasture land and the valley below were all red and gold, and there were pink clouds floating in the sky. It was all so lovely that Heidi stood with tears pouring down her cheeks as she breathed in the fragrant air. Soon she could see the tops of fir trees, then a roof, then the whole hut, then Grandfather himself. He was sitting on the bench outside and smoking his pipe, just as he used to do. Heidi ran towards him and flung her arms around him. For the first time in years, his eyes were wet with tears of gladness. He sat Heidi on the knee and looked over her. "So you've come back, Heidi," he said, "and you don't look so very grand either. Did they send you away?" Heidi told Grandfather everything about her life with Clara and how kind they all were to her. Then she told him about her homesickness and the doctor's advice. When she finished, she ran and brought him Mr. Seisman's letter and packet. Uncle Alp read the letter and put it in his pocket without saying a word. He told Heidi that the packet contained money for her to use as she wished. Then Heidi and her grandfather sat down and had a big mug of milk and some bread and melted cheese. It was the first time Heidi had an appetite in a long time. After a little while, Heidi heard a shrill whistle. She ran out and saw Peter coming down the path, surrounded by his lively goats. When he saw her, he stopped dead and stared in astonishment. As soon as he could get his voice back, Peter told Heidi how happy he was to see her again, and the two friends chatted for a while as they watched the sun go down. When she went inside again, Heidi found that her grandfather had made her a lovely, sweet-smelling bed and had covered it with clean linen sheets. When she lay down to sleep, it was as if she had never been away at all. Oh. Now, Chapter 14, an important day for Grandfather. Heidi stood under the swaying trees, waiting for her grandfather to go down the mountain with her. He was going to fetch her trunk from Dorfley while she visited Granny. The day was crisp and clear, and Heidi tried to take it all in. The mountains, the fir trees, and the wonderful alpine air. Soon Grandfather was ready, and they walked down the mountain together. Granny was overjoyed to see Heidi again, and she told her how much she enjoyed the soft white rolls from the city. Heidi only wished that she had enough rolls so that Granny would never have to eat hard bread again. Then she remembered the money that Mr. Seisman had given her. A beaming smile spread over her face. She would give the money to Peter so that every day he could bring Granny a fresh white roll from the village. Of course, Granny protested when she heard this idea. She didn't want Heidi to spend her money on rolls, but when she saw how excited the child was, she agreed. To entertain the old woman, Heidi reached up on a shelf and brought down a book of hymns. Now that she had learned to read, she could read Granny her favorite hymns. This made the old woman so happy that she could hardly speak. So the rest of the day, Heidi chatted with Granny and read her hymns from the old book. Soon Grandfather came in and tapped on the window to tell Heidi it was time to go home. On the way back up the mountain, Heidi had so much to tell her grandfather that she talked until they reached the hut. She told Grandfather about her idea for using the money Mr. Seisman had given her. Grandfather smiled when he saw how generous and kind-hearted Heidi was. That evening at dinner, as Heidi chatted about her life in the city and how kind everyone had been to her, a change came over Grandfather. For the first time in a long time, he saw the goodness in other people, and he saw this goodness through Heidi's eyes. He realized what a gift this child was, and that his life of bitterness was not good for him and certainly not good for Heidi. That night, Uncle Alp made an important decision. He decided to return to a life that included other people. The next day was Sunday, and Grandfather told Heidi to get dressed in the clothes Clara had given her. Then he took his old blue suit out of the closet. He shined the old brass buttons and even put a hat on. Then together, Grandfather and Heidi walked down the mountain into the church in the valley. The people of Dorfli were already in the church, and the singing had started as Heidi and Uncle Alp went in and sat down in the back. Uncle Alp went in and sat down. The hymn was hardly over before people were nudging one another and whispering that Uncle Alp was in the church. Everyone kept turning around to stare at the old man with the little girl. When the service was over, Grandfather took Heidi's hand and they went to see the pastor together. They were welcomed into the house by the kind man, and Grandfather first apologized for his behavior so many months ago when the pastor had come to ask him to send Heidi to school. After a long talk, the two men shook hands, and Uncle Alp agreed to move down to the village during the winter so that Heidi could attend school. As Uncle Alp stood in the doorway, shaking the pastor's hand, the people of the village crowded around and offered their best wishes to the old man and Heidi. They could see that something had changed Uncle Alp. When they heard that he planned to return to Dorfli to live among them, they all wished him well and offered to help with the move. When at last he and Heidi started for home, many people went part of the way with them, and when they said goodbye, they asked him to visit them in their homes before long. As he watched them go, Heidi saw such a kind light in his eye that she said, "Grandfather, you look so different, so peaceful. I've never seen you look this way before." Grandfather smiled and explained that he was happier today than he had been in a very long time. He had finally given up the bitterness that had made him a lonely man without friends or neighbors. Now, thanks to Heidi, that was over, and he had begun a new life. When they reached Peter's cottage, Grandfather went in. "Good day, Granny," he said. "I can see I must get busy with some more repairs before the autumn winds begin to blow." "Goodness me! Is it Uncle Alp?" cried the old woman. "What a fine surprise! Now I can thank you in person for all you've done for us." She held out her hand, which trembled a little, and he shook it heartily. At last the two people Heidi loved the most were friends. So that's the end of